rapidly growing, or at least for a time rapidly growing, emerging market economy like Brazil is invaluable here. What are the sorts of issues that you see from your perspective with regard to your relationship with a dollar-based financial
Well, there are
system?
at least three dimensions two were mentioned more strongly and one of them lighter. One is a geopolitical thing, like she said. There has always been a dominant player, usually a strong economy with sound monetary policy that makes the purchasing power of money guaranteed, so people feel that they could buy and sell things in that currency because they are accepted as a means of payment. They preserve the value of the currency. They use it. They are stores of value. So usually there is this economic dimension that transmits power politically and creates political space. And it's quite natural that now Europe becoming a continent. You just remember some 20 years ago, 25 years ago, if you drive over Europe, you had to change currency 5 times. If you drive 8 hours through Europe, you would have to change currencies 8 times. As Europe consolidates, it's quite natural that a strong currency shows up here, a strong currency, which is the dollar influence bloc, and be sure of that. Very soon there will be renminbi as China grows up and becomes the strongest economy in the world, the largest economy in the world. There will be a currency, a dominance, a regional dominance of this currency there. And ourselves, we thought many times in Latin America of having, I would say that 20 years from now, if this is the way, aligning around political alliances or economic regions, if you consider the political dimension and the economic dimension, we would have 5, 6 currencies 20 years, 30 years from now, if there was no technology, digital technology moving in. So there will be one continental currency, the euro, another continental currency, quote unquote, the dollar dominance area, and China would have their currency. There are 200 million overseas Chinese. These people live in Philippines, they live in Malaysia, and they trade with China. They go back and forth all the time. And they trade in renminbis. And they will not keep liquidating their credits and debts using dollars. So the way the world is today with these 2 dimensions, we would be going to 5, 6 continental currencies, and that's it. But then there is the digital, the new technology thing, the blockchain. So the central banks will have to strive. Otherwise, very interesting, we had once the gold standard, which was a transnational, a supranational currency. But it was not functional. It was not easy to transfer. So the Libra episode is just an evocating a transnational digital currency in the future. It might be a private money. So the central banks are scared, and they are running to the blockchain. With blockchain and trust that these big blocks can provide, then you can keep with the government the role of providing the most used currency. So there are a lot of new pressures on this thing. One is the geopolitical, China and Europe refusing to have everything related to the dollar dominance. The second is the economic dimension itself, which is these regions will have to trade in their currency, something that they trade among themselves, instead of having to liquidate operations with other people's currency.
My name is Kishore Mahbubani from the National University of Singapore. I'm coming out with a book called Has China Won?, in which I argue that the US dollar, which has been a source of strength for the United States, could actually become a source of weakness. Because, as you know, with its use as a global reserve currency, America enjoys an exorbitant privilege. It can live beyond its means. But with the erosion of trust, which everyone is talking about, and at some point in time, when you get the inconceivable, which becomes conceivable at some point in time, and there's a tipping point, and the role of the US dollar slows down as share of world trade goes down, as share of world reserves, and so on and so forth. At what point does a tipping point come and the US then loses its exorbitant privilege and then has to live within its means? And what will be the impact on American economy when that happens?
scenario?
Well, a moment could have been in 2008 or 9. It would be a moment of challenging the trust of the dollar because of the abuses. The last period that the U.S. was really growing out of strength. Forget about this recent period of trade tensions and get back to 95, 96, 97, where you had a huge wave of investments in the U.S. and you had very high interest rates, strong dollar, but with growth. And then you had the bubble of the tech bubble. It blowed up in 2000. 2.5 million people lost money there, but they lost 90%, 100% of the capital. NASDAQ collapsed. It was a tech bubble. It collapsed. They put an easy money. They fixed that, but they had an unintended consequence. They fed a bull market on real estate and financials that ran over up to 2007, 08. Then it collapsed again. As soon as they began normalizing interest rates, the market collapsed again. They put low interest rates again. Then they fed the great bubble bond. Interest rates collapsed, and feeding the money with. Certainly there was a huge abuse, economic abuse. Recently, it's a geopolitical abuse. So everybody's complaining about the geopolitical abuse of the dollar, using political power to punish here and there. Or China feels threatened by it. But there was also economic abuse. Should Europe be mature and secure enough to stand by their currency? But they were questioning their very own currency. They were saying, no, we must have normalization of fiscal policy. No. The big mistake was when they put in one currency. It didn't mean that interest rates had to be the same in all places. It's like different states in the U.S. The interest rate that California pays on their debt is different from Minnesota, is different from Florida. Sometimes some states go broke. So interest rates could be a little higher in Greece. They had problems. A little lower in Spain. And zero in Germany because they had sound finance. So one currency didn't mean that interest rates had to be low to everybody. So they were not trusting their own currency. So your moment of challenging the dollar was not there because they were not ready. Like China is not ready today.
I just want to add one sentence. Historically, it's not just trade or economy that it determines the dominance of a currency. It's also war and the military forces.
Yes, certainly.
Do we have another question?
It's power, it's geopolitical.
Yes.
Hello, and thanks for the very interesting conversation. I was wondering why countries which are under sanctions are not, by the US, are not part of the panel, or haven't raised any question yet, because the gentleman Zhu Ning mentioned that very briefly, but actually some of those companies that have been put under sanctions have switched from dollars to euros, for example. Yeah. So some de-dollarization is happening, and it hasn't been mentioned in this conversation. Yeah. Can somebody elaborate? Thanks.
Somebody want to respond from the panel on this question?
The monetary system is a living organism. There's a long story, thousands of years story, till everybody accepted gold for its properties, and then we switch it to fiduciary currencies, and then each political unity trying to print its own currency. But if you abuse your power of printing, people get out of your currency and fly away. So it's a living organism. It's adapting. And it's clearly pointing to us that it doesn't make sense in Europe, for instance, to have like 30 currencies. It doesn't make sense. It isn't efficient. So the United States of Europe switched it to one currency. It gave more stability. Of course, there's a price. The price is you lose power to affect your local community. So a big problem we have today is exactly that 3.5 billion Eurasians jumped in the global markets. They muted the inflation. So inflation collapsed, not because the central banks, the Federal Reserve was doing a great job. There was no inflation because 3.7 billion people jumped in the global markets. Always Stoper, Samuelson, Theorem, arbitrage. Wages went up in China, and they were pressured in the Western side. And they brought their savings with them. China is investing all over the world. Africa became the continent of hope. It was the continent of despair. So they brought low interest rates, low inflation, and everybody clapped and said, oh, the era of the great moderation of the Federal Reserve. He was doing nothing about it. It was a lack of moderation.
So I see
they leveraged a lot. It was a big crisis. And people run to that system because they were ignorant of what was happening in America. If they knew, they would run in the other direction. So that is a fact if you study what really happened.